A black man tries to buy a luxury car, but is insulted by the employees. What he does next leaves everyone shocked. It was a rainy, gray afternoon when Everett entered the luxury car store. The rain was falling heavily, completely wetting his simple clothes. Everett wore a pair of worn boots that clattered with each step on the shiny marble floor, worn jeans, and a worn flannel shirt. His coat, which had once been a warm cloak against the cold, was now soaked and heavy on his shoulders. Inside the store, the contrast was evident. The showroom was illuminated by bright lights that reflected off the shiny surfaces of the sports cars, creating a spectacle of shine and luxury. The smell of new leather and expensive cleaning products filled the air, mixing with a muffled sound of rain beating against the windows. The employees, all impeccably dressed in tailored suits, cast disdainful glances in Everett's direction. To them, he didn't seem like a typical luxury car buyer. The women in high heels and impeccable makeup and the men in elegant ties exchanged quick glances and snickered, judging Everett solely on his appearance. Everett, however, was undeterred. He was used to superficial judgments. Ignoring the stares and whispers, he slowly walked through the showroom, admiring each car with a keen eye. He had a deep love for cars, something that dated back to his childhood. Even with his simple appearance, Everett had a deep knowledge about automobiles, something few there could imagine. As Everett passed a shiny red sports car, he stopped to take a closer look. The car looked like a rocket about to take off, with its aerodynamic lines and impeccable paintwork. He ran his hand over the hood, feeling the smoothness of the finish. Everett knew this car wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a work of art. Across the room, Grace, the receptionist, watched Everett with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Grace was new to the store and always tried to treat all customers with the same respect, regardless of their appearance. She saw how the other employees were reacting to Everett and felt uncomfortable. Grace wished she could do something, but she felt powerless in the face of the store's elitist culture. Meanwhile, two of the older salesmen, Wyatt and Felix, watched the scene with disdain. Wyatt, a tall, thin man with an easy smile, mumbled something to Felix, who chuckled discreetly. "It looks like we have an unusual customer today," a Wyatt commented sarcastically. "Do you think he knows where he is?" replied Felix, adjusting his tie and preparing to approach Everett. Wyatt was the first to approach. With an expression of false cordiality, he asked, "Can I help you?" His voice had a tone of superiority that didn't go unnoticed. Everett looked at him, assessing the salesman's tone of voice and arrogant posture. "Yes, I'm interested in learning more about this car," Everett replied calmly, pointing to the red car. "Oh sure," Wyatt replied quickly, but it was obvious he had lost interest. "Are you sure this is the type of car you are looking for? We have some more affordable models. Maybe you should see those first." Wyatt smiled, but his eyes showed impatience and disdain. Everett caught the hint, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued examining the car, opening the door and admiring the luxurious interior. He knew he was being underestimated, but he decided to remain calm. For Everett, this experience was more than just a purchase. It was a test of character, both his and the store employees. While Everett focused on the car, Grace continued to observe the interaction from her post at the front desk. She felt increasingly uncomfortable with Wyatt's attitude, but she didn't know how to intervene without causing problems. Grace has always believed that all customers should be treated with respect, but she knew that not everyone in the store shared that philosophy. As Everett continued to examine the red car, Wyatt, clearly irritated by the lack of immediate response, crossed his arms impatiently. "So, what do you think? Are you interested in learning more about the most affordable models?" she insisted, trying to direct Everett to another section of the store. Everett looked up at Wyatt, noting the look of disdain on the salesman's face. "I'm actually quite interested in this car," Everett said, remaining calm. "I would like to know more about your specifications and financing details." Wyatt snorted, clearly disgusted at having to spend time with someone who, in his opinion, had no potential to be a serious buyer. He glanced at Felix, who was serving another customer on the other side of the store, and rolled his eyes. Of course, of course. This is the latest sports model," he said, reciting the specs half-heartedly. "A V8 engine, 450 horsepower, aerodynamic design. It is truly the best in its class." Everett nodded, looking thoughtful. He knew the specifications of the car well, but wanted to test the service and attitude of the employees. "It's the price?" she asked, looking directly into Wyatt's eyes. Well, as you can imagine, this car is not cheap. We're talking somewhere around $200,000, Wyatt responded, with a tone that suggested Everett should consider something more within his financial means. Everett smiled slightly, but didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to explore the car's interior, appreciating every detail. He knew he was being judged not only on his appearance, but also on the tone of his skin. However, he had a clear goal in mind and would not be intimidated. Grace, watching from afar, felt increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. She wanted to intervene, but she didn't know how. Her instinct told her that Everett deserved to be treated with more respect and consideration. Wyatt's attitude embarrassed her, but the store's rigid hierarchy prevented her from taking direct action. After a while, Everett straightened up and closed the car door gently. "I see," he said, addressing Wyatt. What about financing options?" Wyatt sighed, clearly annoyed at having to continue the conversation. "I can look for that information for you, but honestly, I think you should look at the more affordable models first. It would make it easier for all of us," he said, with a sarcastic laugh. Everett maintained his composure and thanked Wyatt with a warm smile. "Thanks for the help. I'll be back soon," he said before heading towards the store's exit. He felt the eyes on his back as he slowly walked out. Grace, watching Everett walk away, felt a pang of guilt. She knew she could have done more to help him and wondered who he really was and what had brought him here. One thing was certain, that interaction would leave a lasting mark on the store in ways no one could have predicted. Outside, Everett stood for a moment in the rain, taking a deep breath. He knew he had been judged and belittled, but he wouldn't let it get to him. Everett had bigger plans, and that visit was just the beginning of something much more significant. Meanwhile, inside the store, Wyatt and Felix continued their carefree conversations, unaware of the impact that this seemingly insignificant customer would have on their lives and the store's reputation. Grace, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Everett and the injustice he had faced. She wondered what else she could do to change the attitudes of her colleagues and ensure that all customers were treated with the respect they deserved. 2 days had passed since Everett's visit to the dealership. The sun was shining brightly that Tuesday morning, and the showroom was busier than usual. The sound of phones ringing and customers chatting filled the air, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. Everett returned to the store, this time dressed a little more neatly, in a cotton shirt and clean jeans. Even so, its appearance remained simple, without the sophistication of the dealership's regular customers. He entered through the main door, once again feeling curious and disdainful gazes resting on him. Grace, at the front desk, looked up from her computer and immediately recognized Everett. Good morning," as she said, offering a genuine smile. Good morning," Everett replied, enjoying the kindness in his voice. Before Grace could say anything else, Wyatt appeared beside her, interrupting the interaction. You again. he said, his tone surprised but still condescending. Did you go back and see the more affordable models I mentioned? Everett remained calm, ignoring the sarcasm. Actually, I'd like to speak to the manager this time. Is he available? Wyatt, clearly irritated by Everett's persistence, replied, Mr. Mason is in a meeting right now, but I can see if he can take it later. I hope, said Everett, crossing his arms patiently. Wyatt glanced at Felix, who was serving another customer. Felix smiled, amused by the situation. Meanwhile, Grace felt increasingly uncomfortable with Wyatt's attitude. She knew Everett deserved to be treated with more respect. Are you sure you want to wait? It might take a while, Wyatt said, trying to dissuade Everett. I have all the time in the world, Everett replied firmly. Seeing that Everett wasn't going to surrender, Wyatt shrugged and returned to his post, leaving Everett standing in the middle of the showroom. Grace, sensing the tension, stood up and approached Everett. Can I offer you a coffee while you wait? She asked, trying to alleviate the situation. That would be great, thank you, Everett said, appreciating the gesture. While Grace prepared coffee, Everett walked around the showroom, examining the cars more closely. He noticed the details of the vehicles, the impeccable finishes, and thought about the hard work needed to create something so perfect. Each car was a work of art, a combination of engineering and design that fascinated him deeply. When Grace returned with coffee, Everett was standing next to a black sedan, admiring the leather interior. Here you go, said Grace, handing Everett the cup. This is one of my favorites. The design is really elegant. Everett smiled, accepting the coffee. I agree. It's an impressive car. They were silent for a moment, just taking in the beauty of the vehicle. Grace felt a growing curiosity about Everett. Who was he really? What brought him there, insisting on being attended to despite the indifference of others? If you don't mind me asking, Grace began hesitantly, what brings you back here? You seem to really want one of those cars. Everett took a sip of his coffee before responding. I've always had a passion for cars, but that's not all. I'm here to see how people are treated. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving. Grace was intrigued by the answer. There was more to the situation than she might realize at first glance. But before she could ask further, Wyatt reappeared, interrupting their conversation. Mr. Mason is available now. I'll take you to his office, Wyatt said with a look of disgust. Everett waved his thanks to Grace and followed Wyatt into the manager's office. Mr. Mason, a middle-aged man with gray hair and an authoritative posture, sat behind a large wooden table. Mr. Mason, this is Everett Thompson, Wyatt announced, still with a hint of disdain in his voice. Good morning, Mr. Mason, greeted Everett, extending his hand. Mr. Mason shook Everett's hand with a neutral expression. Good morning. How can I help you? I would like to discuss some matters relating to purchasing a car, Everett said calmly, and also the service I received during my previous visits. Mr. Mason raised an eyebrow, interested. Of course, please sit down. Everett settled into the chair in front of the manager's desk, feeling the tension in the air. He knew the revelation would come soon, but he wanted to give everyone the chance to show who they really were. Everett sat in the chair opposite Mr. Mason, maintaining a calm and confident posture. He knew this moment was crucial in establishing the tone of his message. Mr. Mason, in turn, looked at Everett with an expression that mixed curiosity and skepticism. So, Mr. Thompson, began Mr. Mason, folding his hands on the table, what exactly would you like to discuss about the car purchase? Everett took a deep breath and began. During my 2 visits here, I was treated with disdain by some of your employees. Specifically, Wyatt and Felix judged my ability to shop based on my appearance and, presumably, the color of my skin. I find this unacceptable. Mr. Mason frowned, visibly uncomfortable. I'm very sorry to hear that. I can assure you this is not our dealership's policy. We will address this issue immediately. Everett nodded, but he wasn't satisfied with just a promise. I'm not just here to point out problems, Mr. Mason. I'm here to ensure this dealership maintains the standards of respect and professionalism that all customers deserve. Wyatt, who was standing at the door, began to sweat. Sir, I didn't know he was an important client, he tried to justify himself. It doesn't matter, Wyatt, he interrupted Everett firmly. All customers must be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance. Mr. Mason gave Wyatt a dirty look. Mr. Thompson, please accept my sincere apologies for my employee's behavior. We will take steps to correct this situation. Everett relaxed a little, feeling that his message was beginning to sink in. I appreciate your words, Mr. Mason. I hope you really take the necessary steps. Regarding the car, I'm interested in finalizing the purchase of the red convertible I saw on my first visit. Mr. Mason gave a nervous smile. It will be a pleasure to assist you with this, Mr. Thompson. We will do everything we can to ensure you have the best shopping experience. Everett shook the manager's hand again. Thank you. I hope the next time I come here, the experience will be completely different. As Everett and Mr. Mason discussed the details of the purchase, Wyatt and Felix watched from a distance, clearly uncomfortable. Grace, who was nearby, felt relieved to see that the situation was being resolved fairly. After finishing the negotiation with Mr. Mason, Everett stood up. I hope everyone can learn from this, he said, looking directly at Wyatt and Felix. Respect is the basis of any good business. Mr. Mason agreed vigorously. Absolutely, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will make the necessary changes. Everett took one last look at Grace and nodded in thanks before leaving the dealership. The next morning, the dealership was in a frenzy of unusual activity. Everett Thompson's visit and shocking revelation had everyone on high alert. Mr. Mason gathered staff for an emergency meeting in the showroom. The serious expression on his face indicated the gravity of the situation. Good morning, everyone, he began, looking around. Yesterday, we had a very significant visit. Mr. Everett Thompson, a customer that many of you have treated inappropriately, is in fact the owner of the factory that produces our cars. A murmur of surprise ran through the group. Wyatt and Felix, standing in the background, felt their stomachs drop. Grace, standing next to them, looked at Mr. Mason with a mixture of relief and anxiety. The behavior of some here was unacceptable, Mr. Mason continued. This reflects poorly on all of us and, more importantly, goes against the values this dealership is supposed to uphold. Wyatt stepped forward, trying to justify himself. Mr. Mason, I didn't know. That's no excuse, Wyatt, he interrupted Mr. Mason, his voice firm. All customers should be treated with the same respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. Mr. Mason looked around, making sure his message was clear to everyone. We need to make a change here, and that change starts now. I want everyone to reflect on how they treat our customers and how they can improve. This incident must not happen again. Wyatt and Felix were visibly uncomfortable, their faces red with embarrassment. Grace, on the other hand, felt a pang of relief when she realized that Mr. Mason was taking the problem seriously. "I want everyone to know," continued Mr. Mason, "that Everett Thompson could very well have taken his business elsewhere, but he chose to give us a second chance. He believes we can do better, and I believe so too." As the meeting drew to a close, Mr. Mason motioned for everyone to return to work, but before they could disperse, the door to the dealership opened. To everyone's surprise, Everett entered again, this time accompanied by a distinguished-looking older man dressed in an impeccable gray suit. The air in the room changed instantly. All eyes turned to the newcomers. Mr. Mason hurried to receive them. "Mr. Thompson, welcome back. And who is this gentleman?" Everett smiled and introduced the man next to him. "This is Alfred Carter, my business consultant and right-hand man. He's here to discuss some changes we'd like to implement at the dealership." Alfred nodded politely. "And nice to meet you, Mr. Mason. I'm here to help ensure the necessary improvements are made." Mr. Mason nodded, clearly nervous but determined to show he was committed. "Of course, let's discuss this in my office." They headed to the manager's office, leaving the employees in the showroom to speculate about what was to come. Wyatt and Felix exchanged worried glances, while Grace watched with a mixture of curiosity and hope. Inside the office, Everett and Alfred settled into the chairs in front of Mr. Mason's desk. "First of all, I want to thank you for having us again," Everett began. "We understand that changes don't happen overnight, but we believe that with the right commitment, we can transform this dealership into an example of excellence." Alfred opened a folder he brought with him and took out some documents. "We have some initial suggestions," he said, passing the papers to Mr. Mason. "First, we would like to implement a mandatory training program for all employees, focused on customer service and diversity. We want to ensure that everyone here understands the importance of treating every customer with the respect and dignity they deserve." Mr. Mason looked at the documents, nodding. "That's very sensible. We can start organizing these trainings right away. In addition," continued Alfred, "we would like to introduce an anonymous feedback system where customers can rate their experiences and suggest improvements. This will give us a clear picture of how we are doing and where we need to improve." "Perfect," replied Mr. Mason. "We already have a feedback system, but we can tweak it to be anonymous and more accessible to customers." Everett leaned forward, looking directly at Mr. Mason. And finally, we want to ensure there are clear consequences for any inappropriate behavior. That means everyone must be held accountable for their actions." Mr. Mason nodded again, more seriously. "I completely agree. Wyatt and Felix will be disciplined appropriately for what happened." "That's good to hear," Everett said, relaxing a little in his chair. "We're here because we believe this dealership can be a place where everyone feels welcome and respected." With their discussions over, Everett and Alfred got up to leave. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Mason," Alfred said, shaking the manager's hand. "We're going to make this work," said Mr. Mason, determined. As they left the office, Everett stopped at the front desk to talk to Grace. "Thank you for your kindness yesterday. I hope you continue to be an example to everyone here." Grace smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I'll do my best, Mr. Thompson." Everett and Alfred left the dealership, leaving a lasting impression on everyone. That day marked the beginning of a new era for the dealership, an era of respect, inclusion, and excellence in customer service. And what would you have done in Everett's place? Would you have given the dealership another chance? Tell me here in the comments. Stay now with another exciting story.